Yeah, so as Dwayne mentioned, we are going to spend our time tonight on one of the most famous battles in at least the Old Testament, New Testament too, I would imagine. The Battle of Jericho, and talking about all that took place there and how geography has an impact on that and the world around it. So first I wanted to just zoom out again and remind us of where we have been so far. Generally, again, we start, the way that this is planned is that we're going to do basically a curlicue. So start here at Tel Aviv, make our way up north to Mount Carmel, up through around the Sea of Galilee region, all the way up to the north. Then we started making our way down south, and this is where we were last week actually at Hatzor up here. And then we make our way down, and Jericho is going to be right about here. Tonight we may, if I get through Jericho quickly enough, we'll take some time and move just a little bit further back up north, actually to about right here, which is where Beit Shan is. So our plan tonight is to cover Jericho and Beit Shan, both in the Rift Valley. So that's that Rift Valley that moves all the way from Syria in the north down to the middle of Africa, basically, and contains the lowest place on the face of the earth, which actually the lowest city on earth is Jericho. And then as you go down just a little bit further south, you come to the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on earth, and it's not too much lower than the city of Jericho. It's that region that is really hot and dry and desolate. Remember last time we talked about Lot and Abraham as they looked over the land, and Lot said, I'm going to choose that place that's down there that's well watered like the Garden of Eden, which it definitely is not now. It's anything but that now. But we talked about why that was. Sodom and Gomorrah were located down here. I think that when they were destroyed, it changed that ecology quite a bit there and caused that to be, caused the Dead Sea to be dead, and then all that region around it also. The consequences of that are long-lasting, thousands of years to this point. You may not know that the Dead Sea is rapidly shrinking. About 150 years ago, some of the British who were coming in to do some archaeology made some surveys of the land, and they did a marking on this side of the Dead Sea that is probably, I want to say it's probably 75 feet over your head as you drive past it, and that used to be the water level. And so it's gone way down, and even recently, they've built all kinds of resorts along this side of the Dead Sea. Actually, there's some on the Jordan side too, but there are many more on the Israel side. And some of those have been swallowed by sinkholes. That as that water recedes, it leaves caves there, and that erodes, and then the resort, one of them is sunk completely underneath and been completely destroyed. So those people who own the hotels along the Dead Sea now are lobbying Israel to continue to have a plan actually to pump the water from the Red Sea is down here, up to the Sea of Galilee, to the Dead Sea in order to replenish it a bit. They haven't decided whether they're going to do that or not yet. They don't know exactly how that's going to affect the area around it because the salinity of the Red Sea is quite a bit different than what you have up there at the Dead Sea, so they don't have any idea how that's going to impact that if they do that. So there's a big debate about whether the Dead Sea will be saved or will it be gone in the next couple of generations. So anyway, just random things that came to my mind as I was talking about the Dead Sea there. This is a little bit of a review from where we were early on, week 1 and week 2, talking about the various different kind of the areas of the Promised Land. So we started here with the Mediterranean Sea being the big western border, and then the coastal plain. What's the name of the highway that moves up the coastal plain? The Via Maris, right? The Way of the Sea. It's the path of least resistance that moves up this coastal plain. That plain gets interrupted by Mount Carmel, a mountain range about 30 miles long that juts out this way and up into the Mediterranean. But above that, to the north, is what's called in the Bible a couple of times the plain of Esdraelon, or the Jezreel Valley. That's the better known name for it. The Jezreel Valley is an extension of this coastal plain, and it actually is broken up into 3 sections. The plain of Philistia. Guess who lived on the plain of Philistia? The Philistines, right? Then up a little bit further north, the plain of Sharon, which was a little bit more Old Testament-wise inhabited by Israelites. They had a very difficult time driving out the Philistines on the coastal plain, but they were a little bit more successful than that on the plain of Sharon. And then, again, the plain of Esdraelon here. Then as you move, again, further east, past the Mediterranean, the coastal plain, the next region you come to is the Shphelah right here. The Shphelah is that transitional zone between the coastal plain and the hill country. And so it's low-lying hills, rounded hills, that are a kind of a buffer zone of protection from the coastal plain. They're a great place to build fortresses to to defend yourself against people coming up from the Negev down here or coming in from the coastal plain. So the Shvela was a very strategic place, still is a strategic place. Then as you move further to the east, you come across the Central Range, which is also known as the Hill Country. And in the south, it's called the Hill Country of Benjamin. In the north, basically starting where it says range here, that's the Hill Country of Ephraim, just based on whose territory, tribal territory that's a part of. So the Hill Country is the place where you want to build your cities, if you're a mouse in particular, because you want to have it protected up in the Hill Country from invaders from the south or from the west. And we talked also about how important it is that on the plain, it's possible to use chariots and horses. But as you get up further into those hills, those rocky hills, it's really not possible to do that anymore. It's just too rocky and too steep for the chariots and the horses to operate effectively there. Okay, so the Central Range. How would you find Jerusalem? Where would you say Jerusalem would be on this map if it was marked? About where the R is for central here, right? Because you go to the top of the Dead Sea, and then you move across about a third of the way towards the Mediterranean, and that's where you would find Jerusalem. Okay, so that's the Central Range. As you come across the Central Range, actually, the range here catches most of the clouds. You guys ever look to our west, and you see the hills that are around us to the side? Some call them mountains, but I grew up in Colorado, so I don't call them mountains. They're definitely hills. But you see the clouds that stack up against those, right? Because of the high pressure system that sits here and then keeps those all on that ridge there. Okay, that's kind of the same effect that you have here in Israel. Most of the rain dumps itself before or as it hits this Central Range. There's also usually an east wind coming, especially in the summertime, an east wind coming from the desert over here, dry east wind, that freezes everything over there and causes there to be a rain shadow on the other side of this Central Range. And so once you get over that range and start to go down into the Rift Valley, the precipitation level drops a lot. So right here in Jerusalem, they get almost as much rain a year as London gets. And as you get further over here, they get less rain, like 10 miles away, less rain than we get a year. So it's a huge difference just over a 10-mile span. Okay, so that leads you down into that Rift Valley. Again, the features of the Rift Valley that are most important for us are the Sea of Galilee here, the Jordan River, and then the Dead Sea, which are our eastern boundaries really for the Promised Land for most of the time in the Old Testament. There are times in the Old Testament where the nation actually extends itself to this side, and even initially when they are dividing up the land, the half territory of Manasseh, or the half tribe of Manasseh, and part of Ephraim have territories on this side over here. But really, it's best to think about the eastern boundary of the Promised Land being this Rift Valley. When you move across that Rift Valley, then you come to another set of hills jutting up on the other side. Those are it's the hills of Moab is what it's normally called in Scripture. Ammon is on that side as well. But there's a steep climb out on the other side of that rift. All right, so just a review of that for you. Let's move on. I want to show you what it looks like. It's one thing to see it from a map perspective, right? And this is what it looks like, and this is a shot of Jericho with an aerial from the west. Okay, so you're looking down. Let me go back to that map real quick. You're looking basically from here across this way in the picture that comes next. All right, so let me get to that. Ooh, sorry about that. I pressed the wrong button. There we go. So this is what it looks like, right? Does this look familiar at all to you guys? I mean, this looks a lot like our area, right? This kind of hills. Jericho is right down here. Okay, this is the modern city of Jericho. And this is that hill country on the other side. Okay, so this is modern-day Jordan as you're looking across this way. The Jordan actually flows. This is the Jordan River flowing in this little stream down this way. Okay, there's very little water that actually makes it down this far. By the time that all of the runoff is taken by the countries on either side, very little water actually makes it into the Jordan River to flow down into the Dead Sea here. Okay, so kind of looks like the surface of the moon right here, or our backyard, if you want to look at it that way. Yeah, go ahead.
So from where we're looking at up to the Jordan, that's all Israel, correct?
So yeah, the boundary for modern Israel is the Jordan River here. There's a little bit of a buffer zone on either side, kind of a demilitarized zone if you want to call it that. But you see there's fences actually on both sides of that too that are well protected, electronic fences and other things as well there too. Yeah, once you cross there, then you're in the country of Jordan, the modern country of Jordan on that side. Yeah, so all that you see over here is that, all right? let's move across then. And I'm just zooming in a little bit on Jericho. So you have modern Jericho down here. This is the Tel es Sultan, which is what we think about as Old Testament Jericho. One of the interesting features of Jericho, actually, is in the New Testament, there are two Jerichos that are roughly a mile apart. And there's an interesting Bible difficulty, as it's often said in commentaries and things like that, where in one of the Gospels, and I couldn't give you the chapter and verse at the moment, but Jesus does a miracle as he's going into Jericho. That's the healing of the blind men, okay? Another Gospel says it happens as he's walking out of Jericho. And so it's actually possible in Jesus' day, as in our day, for him to be both walking out of Jericho and walking into Jericho, because there were two Jerichos about a mile apart. There was an Old Testament Jericho and a New Testament Jericho built by Herod the Great, really. That's where he had another fortress, another palace, all that kind of thing. So you could both be walking into and out of Jericho, depending on your perspective. So when you're there, or even if you just hear it as I explain it to you, you can understand how each author would have his own viewpoint on that, okay? So what do I want to show you on this? So there's a refugee camp down here. So Jericho, modern Jericho, is in the West Bank. And there are refugee camps. There is a major refugee camp right down here for West Bank Palestinians. An interesting facet there. Many people don't realize that Jericho is in the West Bank, but it is indeed. Again, this is looking down on Jericho down in this picture. So Jericho is down here. You can see all of this desert, wadi system, right? You can see that there are, in fact, in this area of the world, there's constantly flash floods. They happen not regularly, but anytime it's raining up here on the other side, a lot of the water drains down through these otherwise dry riverbeds and comes gushing out through this region here. You can actually even see the red here that is the kind of the pathway of that. And almost every year, tourists or even Israelis out on just nature days, nature walks, get killed by flash floods in that area, because you literally would never expect that water would be coming there. It could be dry as a bone, never seen a drop of water, and all of a sudden this flood comes through because it's raining on the other side in Jerusalem. So they watch very carefully the weather reports to see if it's raining in Jerusalem, you need to get out of these areas around these wadis. Okay? So there is water that comes through here, but it's pretty rare, and it's usually violent when it happens. Again, just to give you a sense of that. So this is looking down from a different perspective, but these wadis run down through here. So you can see the deep canyon carved out by water over time through this desert region. Again, looks very similar to where we live, regions around us, doesn't it? That's just Jericho from the top, just another view of it, okay? And yes, something I want to show you in this picture is, you see how green it is right here? So again, very little rainfall there, but because of the rain on the other side, when it rains over there, the water gets trapped and comes out underground as a spring. And so there's a constantly running stream, a spring that feeds all of this area here. It's one of the largest banana plantations in the world is right down here. So they grow a ton of bananas right down here in Jericho, and date palms is the two things that they really export from that region. We lived in Ukraine for a number of years, and we would often get our fresh fruit would almost always have a little sticker on it that says from Israel. And so almost every banana you saw was grown in Israel, which I thought was kind of interesting. That's a big part of what Jericho does, and dates are the two things that they're really known for, okay? So that's looking down on it from the top. You see this? This is where we're going to be focusing in on here is the Tel, and I'm going to get to that here in just a second. So as you kind of focus in, come down a little bit further, this is Tel Jericho. Now, what is a Tel from what we talked about a number of weeks ago? Yeah, it's number of civilizations piled up on top of each other, right? They would find a strategic place to build a city. Usually it would be on the hilltop to begin with. You want high ground to build your city on, right? And then that city might be taken over by an invader, and they would flatten it and then build their next city on top of that. And maybe it would be abandoned for years, even centuries, but then another city built on top of that, and then another group would come in and totally destroy it, and it would be built up over a number of, centuries, millennia even, okay? And so that's what happened at Jericho too. In fact, they call it the oldest city in the world. Then there's guesses that it's at least 6,000 years old, maybe even, archaeologists will say maybe even 10,000, 12,000 years old, and it has been dug all the way down to bedrock there. So they've gotten down all the way to what the city was originally built on. You can see this little building here is over the top of Elisha's spring. In the Old Testament, Elisha made the waters pure again, drinkable, right? It was a bitter waters. He threw, by God's power, threw in a log, and it was made to be fresh water. And so it is still fresh water today. Maybe that's due to God's healing the waters there, but that's the spring that then fed this city here. And actually, one of the reasons we know that this wasn't the entire tell is that the spring is outside of the city. You would definitely not build a city with a spring outside, right? Because if you get invaded and you have to go in and close the doors, you don't have any access to water, and your enemies do have access to water, then that siege isn't going to last very long, right? You're going to die of thirst. So we know that it encompassed a much larger area. Even though it doesn't rain there a lot, there has been considerable erosion over thousands of years. And so what's left of this tell is actually very little, okay? This is what it looks like from the side recently. This is probably about a decade old. But you can see that there's this mound here. It has been dug pretty extensively. You can see a large portion even carved out here. We'll come to another picture with a trench that's dug through there to try to understand all the layers that are stacked up there. Okay? Questions so far on what we see at Jericho? I want to make sure I'm answering anybody's question. We've got a lot more to say, but all right. Let me test your knowledge a little bit more then. So we talked about. Well, we didn't actually talk about it in this class, so I can't test your knowledge too much on that. But remember, we talked about the different ages, right? You had the Bronze Age, you had the Iron Age, the Stone Age, okay? Through each of those ages, you have certainly the metals that are being used to produce tools, or the materials used to produce tools. But you also have various different technological advances, okay? And one of those, it has to do with walls, okay? So in the time of Abraham, the walls that were built around cities were largely built out of mud brick. It was the cheapest material, easiest to build with, and you could build huge walls out of mud brick. It didn't take long to build those walls, and you could do it rather rapidly. If you saw an enemy that was approaching, you could start to build really quick walls around your city. But then there was an invention that caused those mud brick walls to be obsolete. Anybody know what that? Well, anybody who hasn't been to Jericho with me know what that invention was, or can guess what that invention was? Or anybody who has been, do you guys remember what it was? It's a battering ram. You guys heard of these things? Okay. If you've seen The Lord of the Rings, you've seen battering rams, right? Where the orcs bring in this big thing to pound on the doors of the gates until that door shatters, right? Or the bolt that's holding the door shatters. Okay, so when you bring up a battering ram against a mud brick wall, it's going to cave in. They're going to be able to crush the mud brick wall and make their way into the city. And so when the battering ram was invented, cities started to say, well, what are we going to do then to protect ourselves? And they came up with the next invention, and that was a better wall, right? So every time you have a new technology, you've got to have a new counter technology to that technology, right? So somebody came up with this idea, and I don't know, his name isn't in the history books anywhere, but he said, or they said, well, what we should do is build a stone wall first. Actually, the best idea, and this probably took a little while to figure this out, was to build one stone wall, and then a little bit further inside another stone wall, and then to pack a bunch of earth in between those two stone walls, like a sandwich, okay? Now they call it a retaining wall or a revetment wall. So a sandwich, basically, where it's packed with earth, okay? And so you've got the stones on the outside, earth on the inside. The earth is the material that's cheap and quick to fill in between those stone walls, right? What happens when you hit a stone wall with a battering ram? The battering ram breaks, right? It actually makes the stone wall even more compacted, right? So you're actually making it stronger by trying to hit it with a battering ram, okay? So this is what they did. They started to build stone walls. Let me show you a diagram kind of the walls of Jericho and how this worked there, okay? So they build a stone wall down here. They would have an earthen embankment between that stone wall and another stone wall back here. So stone wall here, earthen embankment here, okay? On top of this then, let's say you build that up to about 20 feet high. And then it's really hard to get your battering ram up over 20 feet. So then you can build a mud brick wall on top of your stone wall, okay? Again, because it's quick and it's effective, and you can build a really high wall with that, all right? So that's what they would do. They'd build a stone wall here, earthen embankment here, then they would put mud bricks on top of that. what would happen, let's say, if the army did somehow get through this first layer of bricks? Now they're on a hill between this layer of bricks and this layer of bricks. So what do? You put a bunch of archers or stone throwers, whatever it might be, up on top of this wall, and now you've got them trapped between two walls on an earthen ramp, right? Not a great place to be if you're trying to invade a city. Does that make sense to you guys? It's a kill zone, really, right? And so they said this is the most effective thing that they could do, okay? And then build another stone wall back here, okay? Or, sorry, a brick wall up on top of that. So what is the counter technology to that? Let's say we are living in the late Bronze Age, and we say, oh no, they have this sophisticated wall. All we have is a battering ram. How in the world are we going to use our battering ram to get into the city? Catapult, yeah, catapult is one thing. You can start launching things over there, but eventually you're going to have to get inside that city, right? If that wall doesn't fall through, then even with a catapult, sure, maybe killed people inside, but you're still not able to access all their goodies, right? So what do? Siege ramp, right? What's a siege ramp? Well, they would take turns piling stones up over the top of this wall to make a ramp that they can then hit this wall with their battering ram. That's very dangerous, obviously. All the people, while you're building that siege ramp, they're not just saying, oh, I wonder what they're doing down there, right? They're throwing stuff down on you, shooting you with arrows, boiling oil, whatever it might be, to try to discourage you from building your siege ramp. So this is a long process. The Romans figured out that the best way to build a siege ramp was to capture people from a neighboring town and make them build the siege ramp, right? Because they would be relatives or friends or countrymen of the people inside those walls. So those people would be less likely to kill the people who are building the siege ramp. Okay, we'll wait it out. Maybe the Romans will get bored, or maybe they'll go away, right? Somehow go away. Or maybe another army will come along and take out those who are trying to infiltrate our town. Are you guys excited by this? This is warfare. This is fun stuff, right? Okay? So they build that siege ramp, and then they run their battering ram up to the bottom of this wall and start hammering away at that mud brick wall. Sure, it takes a long time, but eventually you're going to get through that mud brick wall, right? We've got all the patience in the world and all the slaves to build the siege ramp, so we'll just wait it out. In the meantime, all the people within these walls have no water, have no food, and you're also torturing people outside of those walls. So they say, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't give up, right? Well, they don't tell you that even if you do give up, we're going to do this to you. Well, we'll talk about some really fun things they decided to do to captives some other time. It's kind of the same things I do to people who don't do well on my Menti quiz, but just kidding. All right, so you understand how this wall works? Okay, so this is a stone revetment wall. This is a mud brick wall on top of that. This is exactly how Jericho was built. Let me show you. So the next picture, this one actually is from Lachish, a city to the south in the Shvelah. And you can see up on top, so this is the siege ramp that was built by the Assyrians, actually, to try to get their way up into Lachish. And they did make it up into Lachish. And actually what they show up on top is they've got like a mock fortress here with guys up here with arrows shooting them down. Down below they have siege ramps and, so siege engines and all that kind of stuff depicted as well to show you how warfare was done. So they built their siege, this is all the siege ramp that still remains from the time when the Assyrians took Lachish. All right? So kind of understand how this city works and what's going on here. It's really important when we start to talk about Jericho. So if you have your Bibles, actually, and would like to turn to them, so we'll make sure I'm back on my notes. All right. So we talked a little bit about divide and conquer, right? This was in your quiz. The God-given strategy for Joshua to take the promised land was called divide and conquer. Can somebody explain to me how that worked? What's the idea about the divide and conquer?
They went for the center first.
Yep.
So that they could join forces and then north.
South and then north, yep. So really, yeah, good job, Wendy. So they would take out the center first, right? So where was in the center of the attack? You guys remember from the book of Joshua, what were the first two places they took? Jericho and then Ai, right? So they took out the center first to divide the south from the north. Then they took the south, and then they took the north, okay? Last week we were talking about Hatzor up in the north, and we talked about it being the rallying point for all of the northern Canaanites. As soon as they understood that Jericho was being attacked, then at Hatzor they said, okay, everybody rally together at Hatzor, and then we're going to attack all at one time, right? I just can't help it. I always think about Andre the Giant saying I'm going to use different moves when I'm fighting just one person than when I'm fighting a whole gang, right? And that's exactly what is happening. They're trying to come together to fight, not just one at a time like a Bruce Lee movie, right? But all together, ganging up on the Israelites as they come into the north. Okay, so we saw that happened at Hatzor. And now we're going to see what happened actually at the very beginning as they come into the land from across the Jordan. All right, I also want to remind you that the Canaanites knew that they were coming, right? Remember we talk about in Joshua that there being the 12 spies that were sent out to check out the land. Do you think the Canaanites had counter spies? Yeah, they were engaged in espionage as well, right? So they had people living amongst the Israelites as they were on the other side of the Jordan waiting to come in. So they knew exactly what the plan was. How do we know that? Well, even when we get to Rahab, right? She tells the spies who come to stay with her in Jericho, we've heard all about you, right? And we've been basically quaking in our boots, wondering when you were going to come in and attack us. And we knew that your God is a fearsome God because he's able to have a pillar of cloud by fire, pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. There's bread falling out of the sky to feed you guys every day. And so we know about these things, and we know that you have your sights set on coming into this land. And so they've been preparing for this battle for some time. And actually, I think the Canaanites are pretty sure that when the Israelites come to Jericho, there's no way they're going to defeat Jericho. It is the most technologically advanced wall system anywhere in the land. And so they think, okay, we'll see what happens when they get to Jericho, right? I feel bad for the Jerichoites because they're the guinea pigs, right? If they fall, then the other ones have some idea about how we're going to attack these Israelites. But really the first engagement is there at Jericho. And you guys know the story. We're going to take a little bit of time with it. But I want to set the stage for you a little bit by turning to Joshua chapter 5. And just to set the stage again, we're in the late Bronze Age. This is about 1406 BC or somewhere in that neighborhood. Remember, the Exodus happens in about 1446. They wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. And so about 1406, remember we're counting down backwards towards the New Testament era. 1406 is the time when they're finally ready to go in and take the first of the cities in the Promised Land. So here we are in Joshua chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. And I just want to explain some things as we walk through this. So beginning in verse 10 of Joshua 5. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal. All right, so Gilgal was their first camp on the western side of the Jordan River, just a little bit further north than Jericho. We haven't been able to discover yet where Gilgal is. There's a lot of different theories on that. In fact, there's a lot of people that believe there's 2 different Gilgals. So we don't know yet where that was, but I think there's good reason for that. It was meant to be a temporary camp, a place from which to attack, but it wasn't meant to be a permanent settlement for the Israelites. So they didn't really build long-lasting buildings there. So I don't know that we should think that we could discover Gilgal. There's probably not much left for us to discover there. All right, I made it all the way through to the first comma. Let me try that again. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. Okay, so they're outside of Jericho, and they're celebrating the Passover. Now, I want you to think about this a second. When is the Passover? What's that? In the springtime, right? The springtime. And what is the Passover about? Why do they keep the Passover? What is the festival involving? Why do that? It talks about the Exodus, right? It's talking about that last of the 10 plagues, right? Where the angel of death would pass over any house that had the blood of the lamb sprinkled on the doorpost and the lintel of that house. Okay, so they pass over, the angel would pass over those houses. It also, though, celebrates a time of the year. And actually, all of the festivals of Israel have to do with usually harvests as well, okay? And so there's a spring harvest and there's a fall harvest in particular. And the Passover is the spring harvest, okay? It's the first time that in the year where it's actually kind of the end of their year as they understand it, but that's what they are celebrating at that time. So it's a time when you're bringing in the grain in particular. That's going to be important for what we see here later on. What does Passover coincide with in our calendar, by the way? It's Easter, right? Easter is supposed to be tied to Passover. They're both actually tied to the lunar calendar, and so Easter and Passover are both based on that, and they should really coincide because we know that Jesus was crucified on that Passover weekend, on the Friday of Passover. Okay, So back to, I think we can go back to our passage, all the way through verse 10 so far. Let's go to verse 11. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. Okay? One more sentence. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. Okay? The manna ceased, and they start to eat of the produce of the land, which means they've been there for a little while, long enough at least to plant and harvest their first crop. Okay? And then God causes the manna to cease because he wants them no longer to be dependent on him for their food, right? Now they're going to be self-sustaining self-sustaining to the degree that they're harvesting the things that still God gives to them. Does that make sense? But he wants them to understand that now you're going to eat of this grain of the land. I don't have to provide for you manna every day. All right? That's important for what we're going to come to next. All right, some more. Yes, go ahead.
I thought they were able to go in and eat of the produce that they hadn't planted.
Yeah, there's going to be some of that. Yeah, so God, it's a good point, Debbie. In Deuteronomy, God promises several times that when they get into the land, they're going to enjoy crops that they didn't, well, really it's about fruit trees that they didn't plant, vineyards that they didn't plant, houses that they didn't build. But that doesn't go for the crops, because those are yearly. I mean, those are, the perennials like the grapes and the fruit trees. Yeah, so the wheat and all that, you still have to plant, harvest, all of that. So there is a dependence on God for the rain that he's going to send in both of those ways. There's such a difference between the economy of Egypt, where they had been for those 400 years, and that of the Promised Land. When God describes that land flowing with milk and honey, he's describing a very different industry than they're used to in Egypt. Right? Egypt is dependent on the flooding of the Nile, which brings in the silt from the rich lands to the south, and every year it brings that. There's no need for rainfall. In fact, they don't get any rainfall in northern Egypt. It's all dependent on the flow of the Nile and the flooding of the Nile. But that's very different when you get into the land of Israel, where they're dependent on the rain and the dew that's going to help their crops to grow. And so God is causing them to be dependent, or know that they're dependent on him for even the rains that cause the crops to grow. So really it has more to do with the fruit trees and the vineyards than it does with the annual crops like that. So good question, though. All right, so back to our notes. Again, notice that this is the spring and they ate the produce of the land. So this would have been the barley harvest that they're enjoying. This is the first one around Passover time, is the barley harvest. All right, let's keep going. Now remember that a walled city in ancient times, right? All the people generally live outside with their crops and their herds and their flocks out in the areas around. When do they come inside of that walled city? Yeah, when they're being threatened or attacked by an invading army, right? And the idea then is to grab everything you can, especially your grain and your harvest, whatever you've just got, and bring it inside the walled city so that you'll have something to survive on during this siege. Okay? So this would have been, the inhabitants of Jericho would have been doing this at the same time the Israelites were taking the grain that they were celebrating the Passover over. Okay? So all of them are bringing in the crops. And so what the Israelites were eating, the Jerichoites would have been eating inside of their walled city too. Let's move on. Let's go to the same chapter, but verse 15. So you know the story of Joshua 6, but let's go down to verse 15. You know that everything they've been doing here, they've been doing for 6 days, marching around the city, right, every day. And now the seventh day comes, and here we are at verse 15, sorry. On the seventh day, did I say it's Joshua 6? Okay, Joshua 6, sorry. Verse 15, we're skipping ahead a little bit in the story. Wow, it is getting really hot in here. What happened to the air conditioning? Yeah, would you mind? That would be great. Y'all are falling asleep here. I feel like I got to get you up and walk you around 7 times around the building or something before we get going on this here. So verse 15 of chapter 6. On the 7th day, they rose early, that's the Israelites, at the dawn of day, and marched around the city, that's Jericho, in the same manner 7 times. It was on that day that they marched around the city 7 times, only that day. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown their trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you this city." All right, I have some actual, all right. We'll come back to that. All right. So let's keep going. Back to our notes. Verse 12, "And the city and all that was in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent." Verse 18. But you keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, okay? Lest, when you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. But all silver and gold and every vessel of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall be given into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. All right, so a couple things I want to highlight there for you. First of all, this idea of devoted to destruction, and this is what we saw at Hatzor, right? That they were supposed to burn all of the things, only in 3 places: Jericho, Hatzor, and Megiddo. Those are the 3 places that they're supposed to burn by fire. And so they do that. They pack all of that in with wood and then burn it up. Now, this is extremely rare in Old Testament warfare, right? If you were an invading army, you just spent months trying to capture a city, you're probably pretty hungry, right? So when you go into a place, what are you looking for? Provisions, right? Food, right? Anything that they have left, we're going to take for ourselves. But God says, I don't want you to take all that stuff for yourselves. Why not? Yeah, showing their trust and their dependence on him, right? God is going to provide for their needs. They don't need to take it from the Jerichoites here. He's going to provide for them, okay? So this, again, very rare. If you're a Canaanite army coming in to destroy a place, you're definitely going to take with you the gods of that place and the food of that place. Those are the 2 things that you're really after. You want to feed your army who's been working so hard to take it, okay? And so that's the first thing we want to see. The second thing we want to see is this phrase that really before the beginning of the 19th century, nobody knew how to interpret. And it's this fell down flat. In Hebrew, the idea is that the wall fell down underneath itself. And translators for hundreds of years struggled to figure out how in the world does a wall fall down underneath itself? Why would you say something like that? A wall doesn't fall down underneath itself, okay? And yet, when they come to it, then the archaeologists, what they find is that this is exactly what happened at Jericho. Now, there's a number of different archaeologists who came to dig at Jericho. And actually, each of them has their own worldview, they have their own agenda, they have their own history, they have what they're looking for. And they actually have what they're looking not to find as well. Right? They have a theory about what they should find when they come to a particular place. And so actually, it depends a lot on when you come to a place and what's going on in the world, what you actually find at that place and how you interpret what you find. Archaeology is an interpretive science. There are facts, there are things you can find in the ground, but then there's other things that you have to figure out, well, what does it mean? Why is this thing here? Or what was it for? Or what happened to make it come to this place? And those are things that are interpretive ideas. Unless we have a text or an inscription, very difficult to interpret what's actually happening when you dig something up out of the ground. Wow, that's a neat piece of pottery, but what does it mean, right? And so in the 1930s, a man named John Garstang dug at Jericho. And this was one of the first places that he wanted to dig. He was archaeology was a pretty brand new science. It really only started in the 1850s, a little bit later than that. And they hadn't been doing it very often or in very many places in the world. But John Garstang had a project in mind, and it was trying to figure out how to date things by pottery. We talked about this a number of weeks ago, right? The different succession of pottery over the years. And so you find pottery that's used in one place at one time, 120 years later, 200 years later, they start to use a different kind of pottery. Imagine if they were digging in your house and they found something from the 1970s, like they found an 8-track recorder, right? And then later on they find a tape player, maybe a record player in between, right? And then finally they find like CD players. And then they find things that don't have anything in them. They're just little digital players, right? They would note that, okay, where we're finding those 70s tape players, right? What are they called? The 8-tracks? That must be 70s, and then 80s, and then 90s, and then 2000s and beyond. Does that make sense? It's a way of layering and understanding what came before what. Now, what really messes that up, if somebody's into retro things, right? They still have record stores around, right? So you could say, oh yeah, I mean, my grandma loved this pot, and so I'm going to keep this pot as a memento of grandma, right? And so that could really mess things up if somebody had all of those, a collection of pottery through their lifetime, okay? And so what John Garstang finds out is that there is a way, at least pretty closely, to date this pottery. You find particular kinds of pottery, even the materials that it's made of, or the decorations that are put on it from different periods of time. So he chronicles all of those things. And John Garstang came to Jericho and he dug. And what he found was that there was a copious amount, as he said, of late Bronze Age pottery. He said he found it absolutely everywhere at Jericho. And he took what he found, and most of it now is in the basement of the British Museum in England. Okay? And it's been cataloged. He did lots of reports on it, and he said, yeah, I found Bronze Age pottery all over the place. Now, John Garstang was not a believer in the Bible. He had no axe to grind with any of this, but he was really interested in dating pottery. And so he's the one who came up with the system for doing that. He did this in the 1930s. In the 1950s, well, think about what happened politically between the 1930s and the 1950s, right? This territory really changed hands. In the 1950s, Jericho was firmly under the control of really the Jordanians. Okay, the Jordanians had come in and taken it over. So they hire Kathleen Kenyon to come in and dig here at Jericho. And because she's working for the Jordanians, she's going to say, I don't think I find any biblical evidence at all for the existence of Joshua. And so when she digs through there, she actually digs this trench that you're looking at right here. Okay, you see this trench that runs right up the middle of that? Kathleen Kenyon dug that in the 1950s. And what she says is there's absolutely no evidence that this place was even occupied at the time that the Bible says that Joshua came here. She said if people had been living here during Joshua's day, then we would definitely find what she called bichrome Cypriot pottery. What she said was that all over Israel, during this late Bronze Age, when Joshua was supposed to have lived, there were people importing pottery from Cyprus. And it has very specific painting and other details to it that's very different from anything that was produced in Israel. She said, I found absolutely no bichrome Cypriot pottery at Jericho, which means that this place was abandoned. All right. So the absence of evidence to her became the evidence of absence, right? I didn't find this, which means that it didn't exist there. Problem is, what did she dig right there? Well, one of the problems. Where did she dig, right? One particular place. Is it possible that part of the city wasn't inhabited, or that they just didn't use pottery in that? Maybe it was a horse stable, right? And you don't have pottery in that particular area, right? So she didn't dig widely through that whole place, and she completely discounted the evidence from John Garstang, who was the one who pioneered the dating system for pottery. And so she says, Garstang doesn't know what he's talking about. I didn't find this pot that I was looking for, so this couldn't have been occupied at that time, all right? But in her reports, she says, I did find something interesting. All the way around Jericho where I dug, I found that there was a stone wall, which also disproves the Bible, because the Bible says that the wall fell down. And outside of that stone wall, what I found was mud bricks that had fallen down all the way around the perimeter of that city. And she said, I don't know, I can't explain it. She said, there must have been an earthquake that caused all this mud bricks. Maybe it was houses that were built on top of that wall. They all fell over, right? Until we look back at that diagram, right? About how walls were built. Don't get distracted by the French peas again, but, right? How walls were built, okay? So a stone wall with a mud brick wall on top of that. Now let's say, for instance, that the Bible is correct, right? They march around this wall, and the wall falls down. According to the Bible, it all fell out so that they could walk up straight in front of them, wherever they were around the outside of that wall. Does that make sense? So Kathleen Kenyon says it must have been an earthquake that caused that to happen. You guys, what happens in an earthquake? Things fall down, but they all fall one direction, right? So if you were on let's say you were on the east side of that city, the wall would fall towards the west. If you're on the west side of that city, the wall would fall towards the west, right? They'd all fall in one direction. So you'd have some falling within the city, some falling just random places on the sides perhaps, but then some falling outside of the city, right? You would not have everywhere the walls falling outside, creating ramps to walk up into the inside of the city. So all over Kathleen Kenyon's reports, she says, I found mysterious mud bricks outside of the walls, but I found absolutely no evidence that the walls of Jericho were ever destroyed or that this place was occupied during the time of Joshua. All right, another thing she finds. Let me get to it here. Okay, and actually in this picture, let me show you what we're talking about. So this is that stone wall, that revetment wall, that retaining wall right here, okay? There's another one of those back here. You see that? In between them would have been that earthen embankment, and on top of both of these would have been that mud brick wall that we showed you, again, right here. Okay, so this is what it looks like, an artist's recreation of it, right? So around here on the outside, you have the stone revetment wall here, again, that earthen embankment, and then all of those, that top wall here falling to the outside so that people can walk up over the stone wall and into the city. What did this act of God create? Created a siege ramp all the way around the outside of that wall, right? It's a ready-made siege ramp, so they could all walk up into this. Remember, the Israelites only spent 7 days attacking this city, right? 7 days, not 7 years, and some sieges lasted as long as 3 to 4 to 5 years, okay? It would have been very rare to do a 7-year siege, but three years at Shechem, for instance, or Samaria, when the Assyrians came in and destroyed it in the 720s BC, okay? But this is what we find here today. You can go stand on this very same spot. This is mud brick right here. This is revetment wall. This is Kathleen Kenjon's trench. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail of that. Here it is again. Here's the revetment wall. Here's mud brick on the outside of that revetment wall. Now, John Garstang also, in his field report, said, I found mud brick on the outside of that wall everywhere around. I can't explain it. Everybody who's ever dug there and made a report of it, where they've reported on the wall, have all said, I found these mysterious red mud bricks on the outside of the wall there. So here they are. All right, keep going. Interesting to you guys?
Yeah.
All right, let's keep going. Inside, and this is a fairly recent excavation. I think this is a part done by the Japanese in the 1990s. But they dug down through here, and what they find right here, you see this dark area right here? You know what that is? It's a burn layer, okay? It's evidence of this was destruction that happened here, okay? On top of that burn layer is all kinds of ash piled up here for a pretty, it's like 16 inches high, okay? And then after that, there's no occupation of Jericho for centuries afterwards, right? Which I'll let you figure it out on your own in the Bible. There's a curse that's made after Joshua takes the city. I'm ruining the story for you now. So now I can't put it on your quiz because now I won't know if you did your homework. So, but Joshua puts a curse on it, right? After he destroys it, he says, this place will not be rebuilt except that the person who lays its foundations, his firstborn son will die, and the person who puts the bars on the gates, his firstborn son will die. And so there's hundreds of years where the city isn't rebuilt, which is well explained by this layer of ash with then no occupation layer on top of it until much more recent times, okay? So this is the burn layer here. I wanted to take you in and focus a little bit more. Inside of that burn layer, look at what they found. Can you identify what this is? There's pottery, right? And inside the pottery, guess what they found? These were almost all filled with barley that was burned, okay? Again, the only way that makes sense, okay, if you're a Canaanite army coming in to take this place, you're not going to burn the grain that you came there to get, right? Okay, so that doesn't make sense. The other thing that doesn't make sense is, if these people have been besieged for a long time, like they've got the most sophisticated wall system of their time, they're going to last a little bit longer than just to eat the top layer off those grain jars, right? So to find jars filled with barley that's been burned says that the Bible is right about what time of year this took place, right after the barley harvest, right? That it's right about how short this siege was, 6 days, which is unheard of. Of course, like how do the walls of Jericho get breached in 6 days? Impossible, except that God did it, right? And then, right, burned by fire, and they didn't take the stuff. Like, okay, who does that except for they're told by God not to take the stuff? All right, I'm going to show you. I've actually got a piece of that pottery right here. I'll just show it to you. I would pass it around, but this is a large group, so I don't know. It's not very destructible, but this is an actual piece of that pottery. One year I was with my mentor who showed me how to do Israel trips, and we were standing right near this spot here. He reached over, grabbed a piece out, and threw it. And I said, well, I better catch that. And I did, and I put it in my pocket, and here it is. So you can see you can see the curve of it. There's some lines of just etching on it. So piece of, I think, Bronze Age pottery here. I'm not John Garstang, so I couldn't tell you the date on it. And there's no way to verify that now because it's been taken out of its original context. But that's what that looks like. A part of one of those jars, just like that. there would have been barley burned in a jar just like this, or a jar that was on top of that and fell on top of that or something. So pretty fun to have something like that. You can come up and take a look if you want to later on that too. Oh, now I've got 14th century dirt on my hands. Great. Yeah. All right. So all that to say, you guys, when you go there, actually, you go to Jericho today, and you get off the bus. They hand you a pamphlet from the. Oftentimes they hand you a pamphlet from the Israel Antiquities Authority, and all the way through it, it says, "This is one place where we can say for sure that the Bible got it wrong." And so, actually, a lot of Christian tourists don't even go here anymore because they've been so convinced that archaeology has disproven the Bible here. But it's actually, how do you even know what the Bible is saying unless you see the archaeological evidence? How does a wall fall down flat or fall down underneath itself unless you've got a mud brick wall falling underneath a revetment wall, which we didn't even know about until we dug up a place like this? You can't make that up and put that in a text that's been around for 3,000 years, right? That doesn't make sense. And certainly they didn't go and plant this evidence there. Kathleen Kenyon herself, not looking for that evidence, finds the evidence all over the place and reports it as she finds it, not understanding how that should be interpreted based on what Scripture says, okay? So, I don't think we need archaeology to prove that our faith is true. Our faith is true, but it is fun sometimes when we come across archaeology that shows you better than the experts can what actually happened there. And how would we know except that we have a written record of it that's been preserved and handed down to us all of these years? Why would they put a detail in there like the wall fell down underneath itself, or that this happened at the time of the Passover, right? How can you fake a bunch of barley, fresh barley, burned, laying underground for 3,000 years, and then dig that up and say, oh yeah, there's barley in all these jars? Well, how'd that get there? Well, it tells us exactly in Scripture how that got there. Make sense, you guys? We know that this is accurate from what Scripture says. I want to stop there and see if you guys have any questions. Go ahead.
Really quick, isn't it true that they found a section of the wall in the north that was not destroyed where they believe Rahab?
So I like the way that you said that, because they did find a section of the wall on the northern side. I think it's the northern side. I think it's the northeastern side, if I can remember correctly, if I'm picturing it right, northeastern side. They found a section of the wall that was older than any other section of the wall. And it was a mud brick section on top of a revetment wall. And so there was, the interpretation of that is then, okay, is that Rahab's house? I don't know if I can go so far as to say that that's Rahab's house, or if that, or even when that was built, or when it's from. But yeah, there's a possibility that that's the case. What I wanted to do show you is something I do think is important about that. Okay, so we're, again, the P's, but there's something I don't particularly like about this diagram and the way that it's made. So you can see the mud brick wall here, and actually here too. I think that many of these houses that bordered on that mud brick wall would have used them for a wall of their house. And actually that was a strategic thing for the builders of the city, because they wanted to make it, if you did breach that wall, then they would have soldiers in each one of those houses, and now you've got to fight from house to house through a corridor of houses in order to get into the interior of the city. So if Rahab lived on one of these, she would have actually shared a wall with the mud brick wall to the outside. We see this even in the New Testament in Damascus. Paul is let down through a hole on the wall to the outside as well. So this was common, I think, and it's just a theory that I have, and I think there's others who hold this theory too, but it talks about Solomon building the Millo, and that's just a word that we can't translate. We don't really know what it means. And as he was doing the wall in Jerusalem and a couple of other places. And I think the Millo might actually be this maze of houses that are built into the wall as a further protection for people trying to make their way into the city. It just make it the guerrilla street warfare kind of thing that would make it slow an army down as they're coming into your gates, right? I don't think Rahab was probably defending herself. I think a soldier would have said, okay, you're out of here, and let me take that spot, and I'll defend that spot. Does that make sense? I mean, Rahab would have been there because they weren't expecting the Israelites to come in, like the P said. Like, you're not coming in here, right? Your brains are very small if you think you're getting through our wall, is what they said there. All right, I want to see if you guys have any other questions before I move on, tackle something else. Questions about Jericho? Yeah, go ahead, Patty. Sure. Archaeology. Review, yeah. I mean, those all have to be read discerningly. Biblical Archaeology Review, for instance, I mean, they have some really good stuff, and they have some really terrible stuff too. So you've got to figure out how to work through that. Yeah, I'm certainly not an archaeologist yet. I would love to be someday. I don't know that I have the time remaining to do that, to study all that stuff. But so I'm not really qualified to, to give those kind. I mean, I think I can read pretty carefully and understand. So one guy that I subscribe to a lot, in fact, if you want to know more about Jericho, there's a really great video by Joel Kramer on YouTube. So look up Joel Kramer Jericho, and he actually interviews a modern, recent evangelical archaeologist on there, and one of the people who dug with Kathleen Kenyon back in the 1950s. And so in this video, he asks them to reevaluate the evidence and see, could it be right that the Bible is actually true? And he gets the Kathleen Kenyon guy to say, oh, yeah, I guess that's possible. So anyway, so Joel Kramer always says, and I'll just quote him on that you need to do archaeology on the archaeologists. So understand who they were trained by, what their pre-understandings are, who's paying their bills, because that often helps to skew their results a little bit, right? They have, there is a level of interpretation to it, which I would say on the other side means that we need to have really good Christian archaeologists, because we don't want to be at the mercy of somebody who is an expert who says, oh yeah, it's not like Kathleen Kenyon said for years, and actually people bought this through the 80s and the 90s in the evangelical churches. Well, Kathleen Kenyon, she's the expert. She said that Jericho wasn't occupied at that time. So who am I to argue with Kathleen Kenyon on that, right? So we need to have well-trained Christian archaeologists who are at least going to look at that same evidence and say, does it allow for a different interpretation, right? And again, a Christian archaeologist who comes to it could say, well, all I'm looking for is to prove the Bible right, which isn't solid methodology either, right? So we need honest Christian archaeologists who, and that's very difficult. You guys, archaeology doesn't pay very well. And so, so a biblical archaeologist isn't going to go dig at some place that has no biblical significance just to find the evidence there. They're going to go to a place like Jericho or Jerusalem, right? Where they're expecting to find David's palace, for instance, or something that they can write up to their sponsors back home and say, see what I found? This confirms the Bible, right? And there's a huge temptation on their part to say, I'm finding something new that confirms something biblical, because they've got people who want to pay for that kind of thing, literally, right? To fund them on that. So you've got to be careful, even with Christian archaeologists. And there's debate between Christian archaeologists about things. The very guy, Bryant Wood, who Joel Kramer interviews in that about Jericho, talks about John Garstang and all the pottery that he found there, and how John Garstang was the expert. When you go to this Bryant Wood, he says, yeah, the evidence doesn't show that the eye that we found is the actual biblical eye, because there's no pottery from the late Bronze Age there. But John Garstang dug at Eye, and he has all kinds of reports that says, I found late Bronze Age pottery at Eye. So, I mean, everybody has that possibility for, oh no, but I was funded to dig at another place. I think that should be Eye. Right? So, and again, I hope Bryant Wood's not watching this. Please edit that out, Daniel. I'm not qualified to, dispute what Bryant Wood says, but there's facts and there's interpretation of facts. So you've got to know who the interpreter is, or you've got to learn how to understand the facts for yourself, right? Don't be at the mercy of somebody else. So it is good for us to have Christian archaeologists who are well-trained and honest with what they find to dispute those interpretations of those facts. I don't know if I answered your question, but I answered the question I would have asked if I was. I have no comment on Indiana Jones. I really like Indiana Jones movies. Go ahead, Larry. I'll come back to you, Christy. The other Jericho. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, absolutely. So modern buildings are certainly done very differently. Even the one that Herod built in the first century is very different from this. It wasn't a wall. I mean, he had walls around it. He built a fortress kind of palace there, but it's a very different kind of construction. You can, in fact, often you can figure out who it was who constructed based on the kind of construction that they do. Israelites tended to build particular kind of houses. And so when you find those houses, you can pretty well guess that that was an Israelite house that was built that way, a particular layout to that house. So they tended to do things. And like we said with Solomon, right? When we saw the six-chambered Solomonic gate, well, he built that gate the same time period in the three places that the Bible says that he fortified. You find those gates in that style as Solomon typically built his gates. So there's commonality between those things. Yeah.
Was it a big city?
Was Jericho a big city?
The second city?
Not really, no. It was kind of a getaway for Herod. Like we talked about Herod, right, that he wanted places where he could be basically moving from place to place to keep people guessing where he actually was, because he was paranoid, afraid for his life, right? Was he paranoid, or were people actually trying to kill him? Both of those probably are true, but...
Probably wasn't occupied very much then.
Well, I mean, there's people who still have to maintain that, and there's a whole kind of industrial complex that goes along with maintaining Herod's area. So some famous New Testament biblical characters, Zacchaeus was from New Testament Jericho, right? So he was living in that area around there. He wasn't living up on this tell. He was living in the more modern, now 2,000-year-old town there. So Zacchaeus was from there, right? So, and it was a major, actually, it was a part of that route that Jews took from the north in Galilee to come up to Jerusalem for the Passover and other festivals. So it was a stopping place because the spring, there's places to grow provisions, and there's water you can get there. So people are going to stop there, so that makes it a destination place. And there's health, around the Dead Sea. There's minerals that are associated with that, and the dry air and all that kind of thing. People realize the health benefits of some of those things too. So just like we have now people who move to deserts because of the health gains of that. I don't know, maybe that happens here too. Christy, I saw your hand up too.
Yeah, so in the picture, you know how you had that layer, it was like a dark layer that was burned? How come you don't see too much of the dark in this picture if that was within the burn layer?
Well, so this is probably, I'm guessing, because I didn't take this picture, but I'm guessing the burn layer is actually on top of this. And so like there's other things like buildings collapse, whatever, on top of this, and then it gets burned. And so some of these things underneath it get preserved as they were. And so, yeah, so there's a whole science that goes behind finding what you find where, and then how you understand, like, how is this preserved? How is this different? Like, you find completely intact jars in some places that just happen to be behind a wall that didn't fall and then got trapped in a particular place. And then you find other ones like this that are crushed. So there's a whole, different set of things. So I think actually you can see a part of the burn layer right up here in this corner right here. So if you zoomed out here, you'd see the burn layer was kind of on top of this. So that all that wood maybe got thrown on top of there, and the fire didn't make it all the way down there, burned stuff on top of that, and then just the next people who came on built on top of that and kind of sealed that whole layer underneath it. Actually, archaeologists love destruction layers, and they love it when a new floor is built on top, because then anything that you find directly under that floor must be older than what you have that floor on. So if you find a coin, for instance, that's dated 20 BC or something, well, they wouldn't have put 20 BC on it. But you could date it from 20 BC because it was during the reign of King Tiberius or something like that, right? You'd find a coin with his likeness on it underneath a floor. Then you could say, well, this floor has to be at least, the coin has to be there, had to have been there before that floor was laid down. So it has to be at least older than that coin. Anyway, so there's all kinds of things. I don't know. Again, Christy, did I answer your question? I don't remember what your question was. Okay, great. Oh yeah, how did that not get burned, or how come my little piece doesn't look burned on it? Just got into a place that was sheltered, or other stuff collapsed on top of it that sealed it underneath that. All right, I do kind of want to talk about the next place here, unless you have other questions. I don't want to cut short anything on Jericho because I think it's so important, but. All right, what we're going to do then, we're going to move back up the Rift Valley, just a little bit further north. And I want you to remember when we were talking about Megiddo, way back in week 2 or 3, we talked about this tell Megiddo, right? That's in the Jezreel Valley. So this whole area right here is the Jezreel Valley. And this is kind of a picture taken from the air, obviously, looking across that Jezreel Valley. And there are a couple of really important markers in the Jezreel Valley to get your orientation. So the city of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, is up here in this ridge, and probably right about where that area is where Jesus grew up at. It's up on a ridge overlooking the Jezreel Valley. It kind of comes down this way, and then you get Mount Tabor, which is a rounded hill, very distinctive looking there. Okay? And then you come a little bit further, and you get the hill of Moreh. Around the hill of Moreh, that's where the widow of Nain lived down here. There's some other important things that happen there. The witch at Endor, she lived down in this area too. Okay, so you pan around this valley a little bit, and as you come around, you get a chance to be on the other side of that valley. So as you're making your way down the rift, you come at it from the other angle. And so now, this is that hill of Moreh, but looking at it from the backside. This is Mount Tabor, looking at it from the backside. So we were kind of looking from the valley back here this way. Now we have the Harod Valley that comes down this way. This isn't going to mean a lot to many of you until you've either been there or you're going to go there. But this is a very strategic area here because you can see that it's still green, and yet it's going to empty out into that wasteland of the Rift Valley. Okay, it's going to get really dry and arid and uninhabitable just a little bit further down from here. And so this was a strategic place to build a city. You see this tell sticking up here? Okay, this is Old Testament Beit Shan. It was built on this hill here. And this is another place where there are hundreds of years of occupation here. There's really great Egyptian ruins there. They found a really great stela there that has some inscriptions from Egypt in an administrative palace on top of here. What's significant about this, the only thing that's significant about this in terms of the Bible, is that Beit Shan was the place where Saul and Jonathan's bodies were hung after they were killed on this mountain over here. This is Mount Gilboa. Okay? They were killed over here on this, in battle on this mountain, and then their bodies were brought and displayed on the wall of Beit Shan. When that happened, some distant relatives of Saul's in a place called Ramoth Gilead on the other side of the Jordan River, they heard about it, and they said it's not right that the king of Israel's body is displayed like that, you see, especially because he's a distant relative of ours. And so they came and took his body and then buried it. But they came and raided this city of Beit Shan and took his body and raided it. Okay, so this is the only place that is mentioned in the Old Testament. But it's extremely significant for New Testament kinds of things. And actually, it's conspicuously absent from our New Testament. It's never mentioned in our New Testament, except as a part of the Decapolis. You guys remember what the Decapolis is? 10 cities, right? Decapolis, 10 cities, 10 Greek cities, or Roman cities, Hellenized cities, if you want to put it that way. And 9 of them are on the eastern side of the Jordan River, that Rift Valley. But there's one that's on the western side, and that is here actually, it's not Beit Shan, it's the one that's down below it called Scythopolis. And this place is fantastic. The archaeologists always call it the Disneyland of Israel, because there's so much great ruins, Roman ruins, that are left there. You can feel like you're walking on a Roman first century street there. It's incredibly impactful when you get there. It was completely destroyed by an earthquake in about 700 AD, I believe. I have to look that up. But then it was buried and completely forgotten. And so nothing about it was disturbed for over 1,300 years. And they came and started to do excavation there. And when they did, what they found was this really largely intact Roman city buried underneath here. And I want to see if we can get a few more pictures of that here. All right, you got pictures of the tell. Mount Gilboa, Hill of Moreh. So this is looking down on it again from a different angle. This is the Old Testament tell built on top of the hill. So you might wonder, well, why didn't the Romans build on top of that tell? Well, the Romans were all about peace, right? You've heard of Pax Romana. Well, you don't really think of Romans when you think about Romans and peace when you think about a movie like Gladiator or something like that. So they're about war so that we can have peace. Let's put it that way, right? And so they don't want walled cities within their territories. And so they stop living in the walled cities during the Roman period. And they start to build down on the plains around those walled cities. And you can actually see the main Roman road that runs right down this way. There's another one that ran this way. But a huge theater right here that was completely buried until the 1960s. And they've dug it out all the way down to the bottom. And when you walk in there, you feel like you're walking into an actual, like you just were walking into a performance there. Unless you're Pastor David. And if you get a chance to tease Pastor David about this, I'd really appreciate it. When I took David to Israel, we walked in, and he was walking ahead of everybody, and he's walking into one of the entrances here. And he swears that he saw a snake come down and grab a bat and take it and eat it. Pastor David, you guys, is deathly afraid of snakes. And so ask him about that encounter someday. He loves to talk about it, and so do I. I can hear his screech right now. Super fun. I know, I'm super mean too, but okay, so this is that theater, and you can see even the benches, the rows, all that kind of stuff. They've done some reconstruction down here to make it a little bit nicer here, but up on top they've done nothing. So there's a picture from the 1940s looking across this area here, and absolutely none of this is visible. This has all been dug out since the 1960s. And all you can see is the very top of this, and you can't tell that it has anything to do with the theater. So imagine coming through here, digging all this out, and you find all these Roman pillars and columns. You find Roman bathhouses with all the beautiful mosaic floors. Even a very much intact bathroom, a public restroom right over here. And I'll take you all there when we get a chance to go. It's a great place to get a picture of everybody sitting on the ancient toilets together. It's super fun. Like I said, it was destroyed by an earthquake. And here are some of the columns that fell, and they left them where they found them, just fallen down in ruin here. Again, the city was never reoccupied after the final earthquake there. We talked about the Rift Valley, right, being volcanic, but also a lot of earthquake activity down there too. It's a rift zone, so a lot of earthquakes happen there. So huge devastating earthquake took this one out. And actually, I know when it happened. January 18th, 749 is when that happened, AD. Okay, January 18th, 749. In case it'll be on your quiz next week. What day was Beit Shan or Scythopolis destroyed by an earthquake for the final time? You're going to say January 18th, 749. If you're writing that down thinking it's going to be on the quiz, it's really not. I'm not going to. All right. Well, yeah, we're out of time. Except for we have a song to sing. So Dwayne, where's Dwayne at? Oh, good. Dwayne, we have one more song. As Dwayne's coming up, any more questions? Beit Shan, Scythopolis, Jericho? Nothing about that? Was that interesting to you guys? All right, good. I'm glad. All right, let's close this down.